Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Hacienda wash processed Panama from Wes Ngopi. And there's the container right there. And they only sold these in 50-gram containers, so I actually had to purchase 4 of them to get a full review of this coffee. But Wes Ngopi, based out of Shah, Malaysia, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel quite a bit over the last year. And I actually made it a point to stop reviewing their coffees only for them to release this one just before Christmas. And it was too interesting for me not to purchase this coffee, as we'd been yet to review any of their washed Panamanian geishas, and I'd never had anything from Hacienda before. So for those reasons, I decided to go ahead and purchase them anyway. And what's interesting is that these 4 containers right here make up about 1/5 of the entire lot that Wes Ngopi did pick up, as they really didn't have a lot of this coffee, and I was really interested in reviewing it. So this is a lot of what they actually offered right here on this table. So it'll definitely be interesting in that aspect, discussing a very unique, rare, and especially expensive by their standard coffee, as this right here is day 57. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a higher extraction one at a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which usually indicates a more medium fine grind. However, we went a little bit more fine on that grind as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee, this is kind of a great opportunity to discuss Wes Ngopi's roast profile in general. So I mentioned that the very first time we ever tried them, they were super light, one of the lightest Asian-based coffee roasters that we had ever had. And then since then we saw them kind of steer in the direction of being a little bit more developed, not necessarily saying that they were overly developed, but still on the more moderately light side of things. However, since then, we've noticed some of the coffees we've had from them have felt a little bit more developed than that. And for the most part, I noticed that at the turn of the year, as these coffees are roasted at the end of December, whereas a lot of the coffees that we tried out from them in January did turn out to have a lot more of some roasty qualities than we'd ever had from them before. And I'm not saying that these coffees are necessarily overly light. One person actually described their profile to us as being similar to Fried Hat's Filter or Kawa's coffees, and I can actually see that, because I do think that that's a good comparison. Those still, in the grand scheme of things, are on the lighter side of things, but aren't necessarily overly light by a lot of standards and metrics. So that's to say that these coffees do skew on the slightly lighter side of things, but the majority of Wes Ngopi coffees that we've had from them from this point going forward did feel a little bit more developed. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. Well, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 29, first impression through the V60, and the coffee is very interesting right from the onset, as it's super clean yet intense with enough sweeter citric qualities as well as fruit qualities to go with a tea-like geisha quality of this one. The lighter colored fruit qualities are presented in abundance with a wild peach as the coffee does cool down, and it was an excellent first impression, especially given that I did get a lot of those peachy qualities to it. Day 32 through the Chemex, and the coffee does continue to remain a bit intense and slightly spiced, as there's more of an emphasis on the floral tones today, especially within the listed Earl Grey-like aspect. Fruit's a little less prominent, as it's skewing a lot more on the orange side of things. So going into this coffee, I was expecting that maybe it was going to be super overly delicate, but given that these coffees just turned out so intense right from the onset, it did take me a little bit by surprise, especially given just how much fruit intensity there was to these coffees, which I do think speaks a little to the profile of these coffees, not necessarily being as light as Wes Ngopi once was, but at the same time, I'm not necessarily saying it was overly developed. It was just kind of interesting the way that this coffee was presenting itself for being a washed Panamanian geisha. Day 35 through the April brewer, and the coffee was the least impressive it had been to this point, as it wasn't quite as clean, defined, or balanced, with a much more generic citric floral tone to it, as it's reminiscent of the Catalina Geisha, which is a coffee we'd reviewed from them in the past, which I described for the most part as being nondescript. It's kind of the experience I had this time around, as it doesn't quite open up on the cool down in the same way that it had in the past. A little bit more of a focus on the Earl Grey aspect, so a little bit more generic in that sense as well. Day 38 through the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, and this paid off in a very interesting way as the coffee is borderline hyper sweet for what it is. It certainly has the most intensity we've ever experienced for an average washed geisha, as it has an almost candied and butterscotch-like feel to it. Honey and peach intensity giving it added depth, making it a very pronounced experience to it. And one thing I think that's worth noting is these containers were obviously sealed until we had to go through the next group of coffees. So we went through enough grams to get through one of these containers and then went through the next. So these had been sealed. So oftentimes I feel like the intensity picked up anytime we opened one of the new coffees for the first time and tried it at that time, even though they were all roasted on the same day. Day 41 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it was a little bit lacking relative to the previous days, as it does have a unique honey feel to the coffee, and it's a bit more generic this time around. This coffee has been inconsistent in so many ways, as oftentimes it's hyper sweet, and oftentimes it's a little tame. Oftentimes it's very well defined and pronounced, especially for fruits, and then other times it's just a little bit more spiced and floral. So I couldn't necessarily get a good read on this coffee, and granted we were tinkering with it quite a bit, but it went to show that this coffee was a little bit more sensitive in general. Prominent florality in the aroma that is not necessarily translating into the cup itself. Greater focus on the Earl Grey aspect, which is what this coffee would go back to a lot of the time, that kind of generic Earl Grey feel to it. Day 43 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee does continue to remain relatively intense. Every time I brewed it with the V60, it was just pretty intense, especially for that Panamanian geisha quality. Plenty of sweetness to it, unique honeyed scents, and a strong complementary orange, to the extent where it was almost pastry-like at times with a prominent peachy quality. So I could even think of something like a orange peach Danish now I'm kind of thinking about it, as the coffee does continue to offer strong sugariness all around once again. Day 46 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and the coffee continues to remain very sweet and intense, with the illicit honey continuing to be super pronounced within the coffee itself. Strong orange intensity as well. Off brew, there is a prominent florality and just nice clarity overall. So this was one of the better Chemex days, as I had a lot of inconsistency with that brew method in general. But on day 49, at the end of the day, we went back to the V60 with our higher extraction adjustments, and it's still quite intense, especially for being a washed Panamanian geisha, offering a very high level of white florals, which isn't something that I had even mentioned too much as of this moment, mostly because it could be overshadowed by a lot of the citric and stone fruit qualities that were presented in the cool down, as well as a spiced tea-like honey aspect to it and a very pronounced butterscotch-like sweetness to it. I've thrown out so many flavor notes within this coffee, which goes to show that it has a lot of depth, but at the same time that it wasn't overly consistent. Day by day, you're just getting a significantly different experience from each time you brewed it. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have two level 5s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the sweetness level 5. That is so obscure for a coffee of this caliber, so it is extremely sweet. It is probably one of the Swedish wash processed Panamanian geishas that we've ever reviewed on this channel, which is saying something because those are coffees I really enjoy reviewing. So it came in a number of different ways. You see a lot of the other qualities in this one scoring very high as well. The caramel, so I mentioned that butterscotch is a pastry-like sweetness. There's a lot of fruit-like sweetness. There's even some floral-like sweetness to it. So even some honey-like sweetness to it. So you get a lot of sweetness within this coffee, and they're all presented in a very intense sense. Like, if I didn't know better, you could probably assume that maybe this is like a very clean honey processed Panamanian geisha, or some experimental like anaerobic wash, or something that should carry a little bit more intensity than just a true wash processed Panamanian geisha, but nonetheless just very sweet, very intense overall. Florality level 4, correction level 5, and I mentioned a couple of things, that honey-like florality to it, plenty of white florals, but it was skewing very heavily in the floral sense right from the onset, and it was consistent throughout the entirety of this coffee, especially the honey-like aspects of it. So plenty of that, definitely justified there at that level 5 mark. We move on to a handful of level 4s. We'll start with the citrus level 4. Orange, if I recall correctly, is one of the notes that they have listed on here, and yeah, it's a much sweeter orange quality to it. It can almost feel like an orange jam sort of thing, an orange preserves, as it's just very strong in that sense. And then the stone fruit at level 4, At its very best, when I'm enjoying this coffee the most, it presented a very wild peach-like aspect to it, but the problem was it was only present on, I want to say, like 2 of the days, to the point where I'm like, this feels like a super, what's the word I'm looking for, ripe wild peach, to the point where it was the most dominant aspect of the coffee. But outside of that, it was, I would say, more tertiary to the florals, to the citric qualities to it. So even the butterscotch pastry-like sweetness to it, it was buried underneath all of those things. But when I experienced it, it made the coffee extremely enjoyable. We move on to the caramel level 4. I mentioned that butterscotch-like feel to it, and that's something that seemed to open up with time. Kept saying this coffee has such a strong candied aspect to it for what it is that I'm not entirely sure what to make of that, as it definitely was unique relative to any of the other washed Panamanian geishas we've reviewed throughout the entirety of this channel. A couple of level 4s still worth discussing. Finish level 4. For all of the things that I've mentioned, it didn't necessarily have anything that was sticking out too much within the finish, because I threw out just a ton of flavor notes within this coffee, because at any moment you could have gotten any of those things. So I don't necessarily want to highlight one thing, but it's not like any of those had a very long lingering finish to them. Cleanliness level 4. That's probably one of the bigger disappointments of this coffee, because it is a washed Panamanian geisha, so I think in theory you should expect a level 5 cleanliness for it, but I think it goes to show that this coffee was maybe a little bit too intense to be a level 5 for cleanliness, as it's not always directly focused, it's not always directly defined. At times you just feel a little bit of a generic component to it. So I mentioned that there are times I'm like, it's a generic citric quality, it's a generic floral quality to it. Times it even reminded me a little bit of that Catalina geisha. So yeah, it was just kind of mixed throughout the entirety of it. And then a couple of level 3s. Wait for that car to pass. All right, a couple of level 3s. So the acidity level 3. Not necessarily the brightest coffee, though I didn't anticipate this one being an overly bright coffee to begin with, so we can just pass through that. Savoriness level 3, I mentioned the Earl Grey qualities a lot throughout this discussion, as there were so many of those more savory tea-like black tea qualities to it. And then the final thing we're discussing, body level 2, it still had a fair bit of texture. So for all of those reasons, it didn't act like a washed Panamanian geisha. It wasn't as clean as I was expecting, had a little bit more body and texture than I was expecting, and had so much more intensity than I was expecting. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I definitely think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It's tricky because at its very best, it was one of my favorite coffees that we've had this year. And that's saying something, because I will fully acknowledge that Wes Ngopi has been very consistent for me for a couple of months now. But I do have to say, from this point going forward, I've had much more inconsistent experiences with them and less enjoyable experiences from them. And those will be discussed in upcoming reviews of Wes Ngopi's coffees. But as of this moment, I still felt like their profile was fine. It was light enough to the point where it wasn't necessarily overly light as what it once was, but it was still light enough to the point where it wasn't marred by any undesirable qualities. That being said, this coffee wasn't exactly what I was expecting going into it for the most part. At times when I was getting that very prominent wild peachy quality in a very clean sense, I'm like, this is perfect. This is exactly what I'm looking for from this coffee, and this could be one of my favorite coffees of the entire year. But given that it went through cycles of inconsistency throughout the entirety of it, then you can chalk it up to me not necessarily being able to always get the best out of this coffee, or just a little bit of sensitivity and inconsistency with the coffee in general, because it didn't have amazing days, and it also had some of the best days I've had this entire year. So not entirely sure what to make of this coffee. And at the end of the day, usually the coffees that end up being my favorite are the ones that are a consistent cup in and cup out. And this one, that wasn't necessarily the case. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It's a very interesting experience, and I can't recall having thrown out so many flavor notes on so many different days so often for a coffee before, because this coffee just offers that much depth to it. You're getting so many things from it. A lot of florality, a lot of different sweeter qualities, a lot of citrus, a lot of fruits, and just so much depth to it. So if you're looking for a coffee that offers just great depth overall with terrific intensity and terrific sweetness, then this one's a pretty good fit. At the same time, I continue to harp on the fact that it didn't really act like a washed Panamanian geisha for the majority of the time that we were working through it. That's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Hacienda Barbara Wash Process Panama from Wes Ngopi. Thank you for watching.